Clara Morgan sat by the window of the rattling train, her gloved fingers wrapped tightly around the silver locket resting against her chest. It was the only thing she had left from her mother, a small oval engraved with delicate roses. Inside it held a faded photograph and a single pressed violet, reminding her of softness in a world that had rarely shown her any. She watched the vast American frontier landscape roll by, endless plains of gold, patches of rugged hills, and distant silhouettes of cattle ranches. Every mile that passed was another mile farther from the life she had known and closer to the one she had only dared to dream about in ink and parchment. She had never met the man she was traveling to marry, not in person. His name was Thomas McAllister, a rancher from Red Creek. His letters had been curt but respectful. He had lost his wife to fever and, with no family nearby, needed help running his ranch. His final letter had been simple: "If you are still willing, I will meet you at Red Creek Station on the 18th. I'll be wearing a brown coat and leading a gray mare. T. McAllister." No sweet words. No promises of affection. Just practicality. Still, it was more than Clara had ever been offered. She had spent years as a seamstress in a crowded city where people looked right through her, as if she were part of the wallpaper. She had no siblings, no husband, and no suitors. Loneliness had woven itself into her daily existence like a stubborn thread. When she read that newspaper advertisement seeking a bride, something stirred inside her, a fragile hope. Perhaps she could be wanted, even if only needed. "Red Creek Station next," called the conductor. Her heart pounded. She stood, smoothing the wrinkles in her simple blue traveling dress, and retrieved her worn suitcase from the wreck. Passengers shuffled around her, bustling with purpose, while Clara moved like someone stepping cautiously into a dream. The train screeched to a halt. The doors opened with a groan. Clara descended onto the platform, the dry heat wrapping around her like a blanket of dust. She stood perfectly still, searching: brown coat, gray mare. Her eyes darted across the small cluster of station-goers, merchants unloading crates, mothers herding children, an old man smoking a pipe, but no brown coat. No gray mare. No one looking her way. Perhaps he was late. She moved to the edge of the platform and waited, clutching her suitcase handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. Minutes stretched like hours. The sun drifted higher in the sky, beating down on her bonnet. A station worker glanced at her with mild curiosity but said nothing. The train behind her whistled sharply, then began to depart. She turned, shocked. It wasn't waiting? Panic fluttered in her chest. "Excuse me," she called to a nearby porter. "Is this Red Creek Station?" The man squinted at her. "Red Creek? No, ma'am. This here's Red Rock Station. Red Creek's the next stop over, 'bout 20 miles west." The world tilted. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "But, I was told this was..." She stopped herself. It didn't matter whose fault it was. She was here, and Thomas McAllister was not. She looked at the disappearing train, the only lifeline she had, and felt her stomach drop. She was stranded, alone in a town that wasn't expecting her. The dream she had clung to so carefully was already unraveling. And yet, she couldn't turn back now. Not when she had nothing to return to. With trembling resolve, Clara lifted her chin, stepped off the platform, and whispered to herself, "If God brought me this far, He must have a reason." Clara stepped off the platform and onto the dusty main road of Red Rock Station. The town was small, little more than a weathered saloon, a general store with creaking signs, a sheriff's office, and a few scattered houses made of sun-bleached wood. Wagons rolled slowly by, pulled by tired horses, and townsfolk gave her polite but lingering glances. She could feel the weight of every stare. A lone woman, dressed too fine for a local and not rugged enough for a rancher's wife. A traveling trunk at her side. A tremor in her steps. Everyone was asking the same silent question: what is she doing here? She crossed the road and sat on her battered suitcase beneath the crooked hitching post. The sun had climbed higher now, and sweat pricked at her hairline. She dabbed her forehead with a handkerchief, trying to remain composed. "Think, Clara. You must think." She needed directions. A stagecoach. A ride. Something. But when she approached the general store and inquired timidly about transportation to Red Creek, the shopkeeper, a stout woman with a stern but not unkind face, just shook her head. Stage only comes through twice a week. Next one ain't till Thursday. Today's Monday. 3 days. Clara swallowed hard. Is there anywhere I might stay? The woman hesitated. Her eyes narrowed, inspecting Clara the way one might inspect a package left at their doorstep with no label. Finally, she sighed and motioned to the bench outside. You wait there. I'll ask around. Clara nodded gratefully and returned to her suitcase. She folded her hands in her lap, pretending calm, while inside her chest, panic clawed like a trapped bird. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The bustle of town continued around her, indifferent. Occasionally, people would whisper as they passed. Mail order bride, I reckon. Poor thing. Bet the fella dumped her. Or she ran off before he could. She heard every word, though no one spoke them loud enough to accuse her directly. Shame crept up her neck like fire. Was this how they all saw her? Desperate? Foolish? She lowered her head, willing herself not to cry. Suddenly, clouds gathered above, casting shade over the street. The wind picked up, tossing dust and grit. A storm brewing. She had nowhere to go. She clasped her locket tightly and whispered, Dear Lord, if there is any mercy in you, please, don't let them turn me away. She didn't know how long she sat like that. But just as the first raindrops began to fall, a voice startled her. You all right, miss? She looked up. A lanky teenage boy stood before her, holding a sack of feed over his shoulder. His freckles were scattered like sand across his nose, and his expression held genuine concern. I'm fine, she lied. Her voice cracked halfway through. You don't look it. He set the sack down and scratched the back of his head. If you're waiting for someone, maybe I could fetch them? Clara forced a trembling smile. No one is coming. The boy hesitated. Then, without another word, he shrugged off his coat and held it toward her. You'll catch cold sitting in the rain. Before she could respond, he walked off quickly, as if afraid she might refuse it. Clara draped the oversized coat around her shoulders. It smelled of hay and smoke. And somehow, safety. The sky rumbled. She looked toward the horizon, toward where she imagined Red Creek must be. I will not give up. Even if no one comes for me, I will find my way. But little did she know, someone had noticed her. Someone much smaller than she expected. And that someone was already watching her from across the street. Barefoot, with wide, hopeful eyes. The rain had settled into a soft drizzle by the time Clara noticed movement across the street, a small figure peeking from behind a stack of crates outside the general store. At first, she thought it was a stray animal, but then a little girl stepped fully into view. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Barefoot, her dress faded and patched in several places, her hair in loose auburn curls that rain had soaked flat against her cheeks. She held something behind her back, staring at Clara with wide, curious eyes. Clara offered a gentle smile. The child didn't smile back. Instead, she walked forward slowly, as if approaching a skittish stare. Clara straightened. Hello there, she said softly. The girl tilted her head but said nothing. She studied Clara for a long moment, her soaked bonnet, the borrowed coat, the worn suitcase. Then, without warning, she marched forward with determined conviction. Clara blinked in surprise as the little girl stopped right in front of her. Rain tapped gently against the wood awning above them. Silence hung thick, until the child finally spoke. Are you the lady God sent us? Clara's breath caught. I'm not sure I understand, she whispered, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The girl suddenly beamed, as if that were confirmation enough. I knew it, she said, clapping her hands together. I told Papa he would send someone. I told him every night." Before Clara could react, the child reached behind her back and produced a wildflower, a delicate little purple bloom, bruised slightly by the rain but still beautiful. She held it out with both hands, presenting it like a priceless jewel. "For you," she said. "So you won't be sad no more." Clara stared, stunned. Her heart swelled and cracked all at once. Thank you," she breathed, accepting the flower with trembling fingers. The girl nodded firmly, as though a ceremony had been completed. Then she turned swiftly toward the road and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Papa! She's here! God finally sent her mama!" The words rang out through the street like thunder. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Clara froze, mortified. From down the road, a tall figure appeared, broad-shouldered, rugged, walking with the heavy gait of someone used to hard labor. He wore a dark hat pulled low, shadowing his expression, and his clothes bore stains of mud and sweat. A length of rope hung from his belt, and his hands were calloused from years of work. A rancher, unmistakably. He approached with long strides, eyes fixed on his daughter. "Annie," he said in a low voice, firm but not unkind. "What did I tell you about running off without telling me?" The girl, Annie, ignored the scolding entirely. She pointed dramatically at Clara. "She's the one. I told you, Papa. I told you God was listening. He sent her." The rancher followed her pointing finger and finally looked at Clara properly. His gaze was sharp, assessing. For a moment, his brow furrowed, as though he recognized her, or perhaps recognized her situation. His eyes flicked to the suitcase. The borrowed coat. The loneliness she tried so hard to hide. Clara stood slowly, smoothing her skirts out of instinct. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," she stammered, cheeks burning hot though the wind was cold. "Your daughter must be mistaken. I'm only lost?" he finished gruffly. Clara hesitated. "Yes." The rancher looked at her a moment longer, unreadable. Then he exhaled. Annie squeezed Clara's hand tightly. "Papa," she whispered urgently, "please don't leave her here. God sent her for us." The rancher's jaw clenched as if he were fighting an invisible battle. Finally, he spoke. "Ma'am. You got anywhere to go?" Clara shook her head silently. "Then you best get out of the rain," he said, voice steady as stone. "Come on." Clara hesitated, still holding Annie's small hand as the rancher turned and began walking down the muddy road. The rain had lightened to a mist, leaving the earth damp and smelling of sage. Annie tugged her along eagerly, as though afraid she might vanish if she didn't keep hold. Clara glanced at the townspeople watching from porches and windows. Their curious stares followed her, but for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel entirely alone. She lifted her suitcase and followed quietly. After a few paces, the rancher spoke without looking back. "Name's Elias Turner. Folks call me Eli." "Clara," she replied softly. "Clara Morgan." Eli gave a curt nod, acknowledging the introduction without slowing his stride. They reached a sturdy bay horse hitched to a small wagon. Annie scrambled up onto the wooden bench with practiced ease, patting the space beside her eagerly. Clara hesitated again. She glanced at Eli. He was already loading her suitcase into the back of the wagon, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. His movements were efficient, silent, neither welcoming nor hostile. Simply dutiful. "You don't have to go out of your way," Clara said quietly, unsure if this was charity or obligation. Eli paused only a second. "Ain't right leaving someone stranded in a strange town," he replied. Then, after a beat, he added gruffly, "especially when my daughter's already claimed you." Annie giggled at that, nudging Clara encouragingly. "See? I told you Papa listens when he wants to." Clara allowed herself the smallest laugh and climbed onto the bench. The wagon rolled forward with a creak, wheels sloshing through puddles. The town faded behind them, replaced by vast open fields stretching endlessly into the horizon. Clara breathed in the scent of wet soil and prairie grass, tension slowly loosening in her shoulders, but her mind remained restless. Should she tell him? That she was supposed to meet another man entirely? That all of this was a mistake? She opened her mouth to speak, but Annie beat her to it. "Papa," she said innocently, "can she stay forever?" Clara nearly joked. Eli didn't answer at first. His hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Annie," he warned softly, "don't go making promises for other folks." "But she's supposed to be ours," Annie insisted, her voice full of certainty. Clara placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Sweetheart. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Annie turned to her with a seriousness far beyond her years. "You prayed too, didn't you?" Clara blinked, startled. "What?" Annie's voice softened. "You prayed for something you didn't have no more. And now you're here." Clara's throat tightened. She didn't answer. Because she had prayed. The wagon jolted slightly as they entered a long dirt lane flanked by wooden fences. In the distance, a ranch house came into view, humble but strong, with smoke curling from its chimney. Livestock grazed lazily nearby, roaming freely across the open land. Eli spoke suddenly. "You can stay the night in the spare room. Just until you figure your bearings." Clara nodded, grateful. "Thank you." "But," he added firmly, "I ain't in the market for a wife." Clara turned sharply, cheeks burning. I didn't suggest." "Didn't say you did," he cut in evenly. "Just making sure we understand each other." His tone wasn't cruel, just guarded. Like a man who had once opened his heart and lost too much because of it. Clara looked down at her hands. "I understand." But beside her, Annie only grinned, swinging her legs happily. Because she understood something else entirely. Adults made plans. But God had a way of making His own. The Turner Ranch was small but alive with quiet strength. As the wagon came to a stop, Clara absorbed every detail: the weathered porch, the sturdy beams, the worn boots lined near the door. It wasn't grand, but it felt lived in, warm. Annie jumped down first and rushed inside, calling out, "Papa brought someone. And she's staying." Clara followed more slowly, unsure of her place. Eli led her inside with a simple nod. The interior was tidy but sparse, no lace curtains, no feminine touch. Just bare wood, practical furniture, and silence thick enough to hear the wind outside. "You can set your things in there," Eli said, motioning to a small room off the hall. Clara stepped inside. The room held only a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single oil lamp. Yet something about the simplicity soothed her. She placed her suitcase gently at the foot of the bed and stood there, listening to the quiet crackle of a fire being stoked somewhere in the house. She was not unwanted. Not tonight, at least. When she returned to the main room, she found Annie dragging a stool toward the stove. "Can she help me make supper, Papa?" Eli glanced at Clara. His expression remained guarded, but his tone softened by a fraction. "If she wants." Clara rolled up her sleeves. They worked in unspoken harmony, Annie passing potatoes, Clara chopping them with practiced hands. Eli moved around them, repairing a broken chair leg at the table but never straying far. He pretended not to watch them, yet Clara could feel his eyes lingering when he thought she wasn't looking. They ate quietly, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Annie chattered between bites, telling Clara about her pet chicken named Clementine, about the time Papa rescued a calf in a storm, about how Mama sang like sunlight before she went to heaven. Clara listened, her heart aching gently. When supper ended, Annie leaned drowsily against Clara's arm. "Will you tuck me in?" she asked, already half asleep. Clara looked to Eli. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. So Clara lifted the little girl into her arms and carried her to a small room across the hall. She laid her down, smoothing the quilt over her. Annie blinked up at her sleepily. "You'll be here in the morning, won't you?" Clara brushed a damp curl from her forehead. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll be here." Annie smiled. And in that moment, Clara knew she meant it. When she returned to the main room, Eli was standing near the fire, arms crossed. He looked at her, not with suspicion now, but contemplation. "She takes to you," he said quietly. Clara folded her hands, unsure what to say. "She misses her mama something fierce," he continued, gazing into the flames. "Been praying for someone to fill that empty space. I keep telling her that ain't how life works." Clara's voice was soft. "Sometimes it is." He looked at her then, really looked at her. Not as a stranger. Not as a burden. But as something possible. The silence between them shifted. Unspoken. Uncertain. But not unwelcome. Finally, Eli exhaled slowly. "You can stay. Until you're ready to leave." Clara nodded. But inside, she already knew. She wouldn't be ready to leave. Because sometimes, fate didn't knock gently. Sometimes, it sent a little barefoot girl to shout your destiny aloud.